Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CSIS for what I think will be a really fantastic and interesting event today. I'm Max Bergmann, Director of the Europe-Russia Eurasia Program and the Stort Center here at CSIS. And thank you to all of those who joined us in person and all those who are joining online for the streaming event. We have an excellent panel today, and I'm looking forward to the wide-ranging discussion analyzing the impacts of the ongoing war in Ukraine 1 year after Russia's invasion in 2022. Joining me today, we have three fantastic Russia experts. Maybe I'll start to my immediate left with Maria Snegovaya. Maria is a senior fellow here at CSIS with the Europe-Russia Eurasia Program. Prior to that, Maria was a postdoctoral fellow in Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. And she's also going to be the author of a forthcoming report, Russia Sanctions at 1 Year, Learning from the Cases of South Africa and Iran. You can pay attention to the CSIS website, and that report will be out relatively soon. Next, we have Michael Kimmage. Michael's a senior associate and non-resident fellow here at CSIS. Additionally, he is the chair of the history department at Catholic University. His expertise is on the former Soviet Union, the transatlantic relationship, and the history of U.S. foreign policy. From 2014 to 2016, Michael and I were colleagues together on the policy planning staff for the Secretary of State at the U.S. Department of State, where he held the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. Michael is also chair of the advisory board at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, and he serves on the advisory board of the German Institute for International Security Affairs. And he's also the author of a recent piece in Foreign Affairs, Wartime Putinism, What the Disaster in Ukraine Has Done to the Kremlin and to Russia. You can check that out at Foreign Affairs. And last but certainly not least is Dara Massicot. Dara is not associated with CSIS, the one person here that isn't, but Dara is at the excellent RAND Corporation, where she's a senior policy researcher, where she's one of the leading experts on Russia's military today. And before joining RAND, she served as a senior analyst for Russian military capabilities at the Department of Defense. And she also just authored a really outstanding piece in Foreign Affairs, What Russia Got Wrong, Can Moscow Learn from Its Failures in Ukraine? So we have an excellent panel. And what I thought we would do, since there's a lot to cover, is maybe break up the conversation past, present, and future. And I think we'll sort of start by maybe talking about why this war happened. Why did Putin make the decision to invade Ukraine? What was the rationale? What was he thinking? And maybe I'll start with you, Michael, to kick us off, and then turn to Maria to comment on that as well.
Well, first of all, thank you, Max, for the very kind introduction, and to CSIS for hosting this event, and it's wonderful to be with Dara and Maria and to have this conversation at this particular moment in time as the sort of first-year anniversary of the war looms before us. I think that you can divide Putin's motivations into at least two categories in trying to understand the question of why he invaded, how he did, and when he did. It's always worth adding as a caveat that when it comes to actual evidence about decision-making in Russia, we're not in a good position. So, it's guesswork. It's important guesswork, but alas, not much more than that. But I think that you can put the invasion in one particular context of a Russia that sees the outside world in imperial terms, and that has a particular cultural attitude toward Ukraine that's, on the one hand, condescending, as if the country or the state doesn't or shouldn't exist, and on the other hand, embraces a part of Ukraine. Here the category of empire is maybe not the perfect one, but it embraces a part of Ukraine as Russia. And sort of is not annexing territory or taking territory in the eyes of Putin, but liberating this part of Ukraine from an artificial construct, i.e. The Ukrainian state. And the radicalism of this perspective is something that escaped me before the war began. I knew that Putin had these tendencies, and it was sort of his rhetoric, and some of it just seemed like propaganda and verbal extremism before the 24th of February 2022. I think I would now acknowledge that this is really a part of Russian decision-making. Obviously, it's a part of messaging and the way in which Putin has justified the war, but this imperial purview is really an aspect of his decision-making. And therefore, the radicalism of Putin is one of the many things that we have to contend with. I think you can bump a second motivation of Putin's down to a somewhat more practical level. And this is the sense that dawned on Putin's part that he was losing Ukraine. Sort of a potential loss of Ukraine in 2013, 2014, and then what was becoming the actual loss of Ukraine, that Ukraine was entering into Western political, legal, and military structures, and that this, in the eyes of Putin, was a vehicle of American influence in the region, and that if this was a trajectory that would be untouched for 5 or 10 years, this is Putin thinking perhaps in 2020, 2021, that Ukraine would be definitively lost, and that Putin would be the one who lost Ukraine. And so the war in this context is not a cultural project and not exactly an imperial project, but is an aspect of Russian strategy. So instead of letting Ukraine fall into the hands of Western Europe and the United States, we'll break it apart, we'll break it into pieces, we'll control what we can control, and we'll sort of shift the whole trajectory of American policy in the region, the trajectory of Europe, in a different direction. I think it's gone very poorly for Putin, this aspect of the plan, but I'll just say by way of conclusion, I don't think that he's given up on this, and I don't think that he's given up on the first part of what I was trying to describe of this imperial project that he has for the region writ large.
Maria, maybe the same question over to you, but one of the things that really, if we sort of go back to January 2022 or this moment in February 2022, there's a lot of discussion about Putin being this kind of grand chess master, this savvy tactical decision maker or a strategist that would always kind of, make the right decision. And there was this real debate about whether he was a cautious decision maker, that he wouldn't do anything too extreme. Each of the military interventions that we saw, whether it was Syria, Ukraine in 2014, or Georgia in 2008, there was always a bit of reticence in how far Russia would push. And so this led to this sense that he was a cautious, calculating decision maker. Do you think that analysis was wrong, or what motivated Putin to go forth?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just as Michael has said, the usual disclaimer that I'm not crediting myself with being able to read Putin's mind, but I'll do my best. Definitely something has changed, and I think many analysts have pointed out that this time things were different, even if, of course, part of the reasons why Putin failed to achieve his original goals in Ukraine, right? I mean, and we're talking occupation of Kiev, even if I don't subscribe to the narrative that he already completely failed. One of them, the reasons was, of course, that he badly miscalculated Ukraine. And this self-delusionment has been a part and quite consistent pretty much since 2014. We know, for example, as a matter of fact, that in 2014, after this attempted insurgencies did not work out across all of the southeastern Ukraine, but only worked out in Donbass and Lugansk, there were some people fired from the presidential administration responsible specifically for Ukraine and post-Soviet area. That is, there seemed to have been certain learning curve there going on, but apparently not enough. And frankly, as a political scientist, the degree of simplicity of the political system that Putin built and its complete failure, to learn from the previous lessons is almost scary, but also frustrating for somebody who studies political systems. You always want to imagine more complexity than there really is. Having said that, the overall complexity of the arguments that led to this disastrous decision, I subscribe to everything that Michael has said, but I also wanted to add a couple of more points along those same lines. So first of all, I think the most telling document that you can ever read as to what prompted Putin to invade Ukraine was his own article that appeared in summer 2021, where he essentially, again, if you read his language, describes how he sees the situation, right? And he de facto describes along those same lines that Ukraine is lost, it's becoming not just a neutral state, but anti-Russia, and those traditional quote-unquote Russian regions of Ukraine essentially are drifting away. That was exacerbated by a number of domestic developments in Ukraine. specifically Zelensky's essentially attempt to eliminate Russia's influence domestically, such as sanctioning some of the pro-Russia channels, and Medvedchuk, in particular, a person who is very notorious and close to Putin. But so important the role of Viktor Medvedchuk is that his alleged persecution in Ukraine was actually a matter of discussion at one of the security councils in Russia during that time, just to show you how important and how personal Putin takes that. And of course, along with those, like the perceived diminishing leverage over Ukraine, along with those considerations that Ukraine was becoming essentially drifting towards the transatlantic alliance, and also arming and becoming stronger. And there, actually, I wanted to give him some credit because he was not exactly wrong. Even with this Ukraine, which is fighting really courageously, but obviously lacking the necessary weapons, where I'm hoping the West will be consistently continuing to provide the aid. Even with that, Ukraine, today's Russia cannot deal effectively, right? It's essentially Russia is stuck in this long-term war and it cannot win decisively. That is pretty clear. So in that sense, he was not completely wrong. He understood that timing was not on his side. Russia indeed is declining, albeit some would say maybe not as fast enough. And from that perspective, acting preemptively made some sense, even if, as I said, ultimately it was based on gross disillusions that unfortunately led us towards this catastrophe.
Great. Dara, maybe I'll turn to you to talk a little bit about how, this seems like one of the, I guess, penultimate successes of the U.S. intelligence community in many ways, the discovery of Russia's war plans. I remember pretty vividly in the fall reading articles that were in the press and clearly seeing that something had shifted, that the reporting had shifted, that the response from the U.S. government had shifted. So it seems like while, in a lot of the debates that were happening in think tank community and publicly were, no, Putin wouldn't actually do anything as reckless as invading, all of Ukraine. But that's where the U.S. got. I wonder if you could maybe talk about why did the U.S. sort of get this right? And maybe talk about how the U.S. was able to release intelligence in a very unique and innovative way.
Right, thank you. Thanks for having me here to talk about everything as we approach the 1-year mark of this invasion. Understanding Russian war plans is like the crown jewel of achievement for U.S. intelligence. And so my hats are off to them. This is not easy to do. At the time, if you look back at the fall of 21 and moving towards February 22, it seemed like the public emphasis was on pre-bunking. Or talking about, well, Russian propaganda is going to try to do this, they're going to try to create all these pretexts, and they're going to try to go into Ukraine. Behind the scenes, we know now, through reporting through different outlets like the New York Times or Washington Post and many others, that there was a concerted effort at multiple levels of the U.S. government, not only to speak with the Ukrainians, to speak with our allies in NATO, but also to message the Russians directly. These were done at multiple levels, whether it was Department of State, whether it was Biden to Putin, whether it was Burns to Patrushev, telling them multiple times in private and in public, we know about your invasion plans. Do not do this. We are going to support Ukraine. There will be consequences to you. And there's a particularly vivid example between CIA Director Burns and Patrushev, and I think it's important to put this in context. Patrushev is one of the most uber ultra hawks in Russia. And to sit down across the table with the director of the CIA, who's, from his perspective, the main enemy, and have that CIA director tell him, I know about what you're doing, don't do it. That happened in November of 2021. And they still continued for 3 months with their invasion plan. They thought that US Western assistance would not matter, that the Ukrainians would not resist. It would only be small arms or javelins or stingers, and they could compensate for this. They might have looked out at Ukraine in February when things really weren't yet on a war footing. I don't think the Zelensky government had fully activated until a couple weeks ahead of time. Then the Russians may have concluded, we can do this. We've got the force, we've got the numbers. This will be just like Crimea. And there are some accounts now of junior officers saying that that's what they were told. We're going to bypass the towns. We're going to bypass all these Ukrainian forces, and it will be like Crimea in 2014. No one will meaningfully resist us. And all of those things fell apart immediately upon contact. The Ukrainian TDF forces were ready for them. We know now that the Ukrainians were, and still are every day, incredibly resistant. The Russians misread the situation. They misread what their intelligence was telling them. They misread polling. They had actually hundreds of people who were ready to be collaborators at multiple levels in Ukraine. And the Zelensky government, I think they arrested nearly 700 collaborators, so they rolled up their network. Really, it was the military story for why it departed. You can't point to one thing. You can't point to, it's only the corruption within the Russian military. That doesn't explain what happened 8 years ago. It doesn't explain what happened in Syria. You can't, there's the secrecy aspect of it, that they kept things from their own forces, from most of their own forces, until the very last minute because they thought it would be easy. There's just so many compounding errors and assumptions here about what they believed was possible for them that it combined in a very unique way. It ran headfirst into Ukrainian resistance. It ran headfirst into a very sharp pivot about a week in terms of what the United States and NATO was willing to do for Ukraine in the form of sharing intelligence and sharing weapons. So this is, it's a historical moment. The Russians have learned and adapted. They are making I would call tactical or operational adjustments in how they do this. They seem to understand a little bit more of the dynamics at play. But there are many issues that remain unresolved, whether it's stopping Western weapon flows or stopping Western intelligence, and they'll never overcome Ukrainian will to fight. I mean, it's so hardened against them at this point. There is really nothing left but strategic failure in terms of making Ukraine into a compliant pro-Russian state.
So, in your piece in Foreign Affairs, you describe it as Putin played himself. And this is one of the things that I think you highlight well, that, it's one thing to try to mask your potential invasion plans and to try to deceive the enemy. Makes sense, but when the U.S. government is coming to you and saying, we know what you're doing, here's your war plan, and it's on the cover of major American newspapers, and yet you don't tell your officers and your invading force that this is what the plan is. And so it seemed that this operation was a bit more like a psyop than it was sort of a well thought out military plan. And so when we talk about some of the successes of the U.S. intelligence community identifying what Russia was up to, many people have pointed to the U.S. getting it wrong about what they thought would happen once Russia invaded. And maybe you could explain, how did the war, once they decided to invade, what do you think the U.S. sort of got wrong in presuming Russian victory, which we assumed would happen quite quickly?
Well, if you go back in time to that time period, there were assessments that the Russians would be able to overpower different routes, and they would be able to reach the outskirts of Kyiv by, I think, 3 days was what was being discussed at the time. Obviously, that didn't happen, and there are reasons for that we know now. The TDF really blocked a lot of forward movement until the Ukrainian military was well positioned. There were certain key battles that were very important, like the seizure of the Hostomel airport. The Ukrainians were ready for that, and Russia could never achieve a very pivotal occupation of that facility that they would need for other things. But really, the plan itself, myself and colleagues looking at it, if you remember, I think it was in the Washington Post, there were multiple outlets that had all the Russian, scary red arrows going into Ukraine, and we're looking at it going, well, what is this? We've seen multiple operations run by Gerasimov before, limited in scale, scope, objectives. This was very maximalist. It was done in a way that really undercut a lot of their strengths, really stretched their logistics to the breaking point. One thing I remember texting colleagues within the first maybe 24 or 48 hours of this is why did the Army go in at the exact same time as the Air Force? That's not how it was supposed to go. Like, the Air Force was supposed to go in and hit targets for days, maybe weeks, soften everything up. It didn't happen. So there were just there were really top to bottom failures here. In terms of why the assessment was different, I think there's some aspects about the Russian military, the problems that were known, like the structural problems, some of the cultural problems. I think that it was not fully understood at the time, just the level of secrecy and OPSEC that they were conducting against their own forces. I mean, the world knew what their war plan was and put it out in the press, and the Russians didn't deviate from that. They did not even change it. They just kept going because they thought that knowledge wouldn't matter. But I do think that there was a pivot that most folks were not either asked about or not asked to consider, which was what would happen if there was battlefield intelligence being provided to the Ukrainians? What would happen if they were given M777s and HIMARS and Patriots? What would happen if they were told to relocate forces, literally as missiles were flying at them? I don't know if those questions were asked. And what would that have changed the assessment of how this would turn out?
It seems like one of the big X factors that they missed, and we haven't yet really talked about the Ukrainians, is that the assumption that the Ukrainians wouldn't really have this will to fight, and that this would they would march in, the Ukrainians would be cowed by that, and we saw, as you mentioned, there was lots of Russian intelligence activity in Ukraine. There were potential assassination teams trying to go after Zelensky. Michael, it seems to me that Zelensky's kind of the moment where he was offered this offer of we can get you out, by the United States and others, and his line of we don't need a ride, we need ammunition, sort of sent a message to the entire Ukrainian people. And sometimes a leader can make a huge difference in a situation as fraught as that. Maybe you could talk about the Ukrainian response. Is that something that the U.S. anticipated would occur? Or were you surprised by how strong the Ukrainians have stood up and fought? And, especially given some of the divisions that we had seen in Ukrainian society between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers before, maybe you could talk about Ukraine's response.
So just to go back in time, and maybe this is a point that matters for understanding the Russian calculus before February 24th, 2022, I think that what worked for Russia in 2014, so this would be the 22nd of February is when Yanukovych flees the country, and almost immediately the annexation of Crimea begins, and then the incursion into the Donbass is quite a bit slower. That's sort of between March and July of 2014. But what worked for Russia then was that there was really an enormous state of paralysis in Kiev. That's what happens when your president flees the country and you have to call elections and sort of figure out things, also after months of protests in the capital city. So it was a moment of internal upheaval, and I suspect, I don't know for a fact, but I suspect that Russian military planning on 2022 sort of referred back to that moment. Well, it sort of worked then, so it should work now, but that takes us to Zelensky. I mean, it's an entirely different situation. One factor that I think is very significant for the war is the nature of the election in Ukraine in 2019. So it's not an earth-shattering election. Poroshenko is replaced by Zelensky, and this didn't garner huge amounts of international media attention at the time. But what it does in Ukraine is to build the legitimacy behind Zelensky. So he's truly a democratically elected leader. He's also elected with 70% of the electorate in Ukraine, which is unusual for Ukrainian politics up until that point. And you cannot see a kind of north-south, east-west divide in Zelensky's electorate. So he has that to work with already before the war. In terms of surprises, I mean, I think we were all, to a degree, surprised by the quasi-Churchillian characteristics of Zelensky. It's not to speak ill of Zelensky before the war, but his approval ratings were low in January, February of 2022. I mean, this is not really germane, but it's psychologically plays a role. He's a former entertainer and comedian, so you don't sort of naturally put him into that military role, but it just fit. And frankly, I don't know where that came from. It's obviously enormously consequential for the war itself, but it's not a quality that I saw in Zelensky before the war. A final point I would make about Ukraine is that you can invert one of the standard analytical judgments about Ukraine prior to the war. You can invert it to explain some of Ukraine's wartime successes. So prior to 2022, there was a line of argument that Ukraine is a country that is fundamentally divided. It's divided between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers. It has regional divisions. You can point to religion as a sort of non-unifying factor in Ukraine, and this therefore translates into a weak country that I'm sure for Vladimir Putin made it seem especially invadable. The fact of the matter is, once the war begins, the sort of decentralized nature of Ukrainian life, politics, etc., lends itself very well to civic activism. So it's not just that the soldiers on the front lines have been doing well with the war, and it's not just that Ukraine has integrated Western technology effectively, that's all true, but you also have lots of people working behind the scenes in Ukraine who are bringing food to the soldiers, who are sort of undergirding the war effort, and that's a kind of civic activism, I think, that follows from Ukraine's basically decentralized political culture since 1991, really. So in a way, what we understood before to be a debit, and in practice was something of a debit until 2022, turned out to be a virtue at times of war, and I think Zelensky has sort of synthesized and unified that very, very effectively.
Maria, maybe turn it over to you, and if there's anything else you want to comment on from what the others, what Michael or Dara has said, please do. But I want to maybe also turn to what the view was inside of Russia, where this war wasn't simply a shock to, I think, it wasn't a shock to the U.S. intelligence community, but it was a shock, I think, to many Europeans, to people inside Ukraine who didn't believe this was actually going to happen, and also to Russians there was not kind of this march to war that we have seen here in the United States in the prelude to some of our invasions. But there wasn't that sort of propaganda campaign. So maybe you could talk through the kind of Russian public's reaction and what the response has been by the Kremlin to its own people.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add one point that's important that plays into miscalculation on Putin's side, and unfortunately, that's the elephant in the room. That's probably not many of us are willing to assume, but that was the lack of strong enough response after Crimea annexation back in 2014 on the Western side. And that essentially, even if there were sanctions and they did work somewhat in the long term, essentially Russia's economy stopped growing, and there were all sorts of problems domestically, a lack of foreign investment, for example. But overall, when the West, us, right, we faced such gross, unprecedented violation of the international law, everybody sort of kind of wanted to forget about quickly, punish Russia somewhat, but not make a big fuss about it, because Russia was just too convenient for many, right? And of course, especially energy revenues that Europe relied on played a huge role in this dynamic. Therefore, was it really wrong for Putin to assume that, something that would go just as smoothly, allegedly, right, as Crimea annexation went, also would not necessarily generate a strong response by the international community, even if at this time the survival of a state of Ukraine would be at stake. He was not completely wrong, and I think we share somewhat certain responsibility for also driving those wrong assumptions. Hopefully now he'll learn.
Particularly if he had been right about his invasion assumptions and was able to take Ukraine very quickly, we would probably be in a different place in terms of sanctioning, and obviously the military assistance would probably be very different. So
yeah. Absolutely, and Ukraine here deserves enormous credit, right, for fighting and really changing the world, in the sense, driving the Western international response. I think Ukraine really, and its role of Ukrainian society and Zelensky should really not be underestimated. We really live in a different world. Is it hopefully it's a much better world, but much depends on the outcome of this war. Also, it's really a war of autocracy against democracy, and we have discussed the benefits of decentralization. There's also the downsides of having a personalistic, highly, clandestine, secretive regime where hiding the information from your own soldiers actually end up leading you into trouble. And there's also this discussion, is this war for sovereignty or is it war for democracy? I think it's both, but clearly we see that the war also shows the advantages of autocratic regime. From that, of course, to the fact that the war has become the true big shock for the Russian society, and until now you see essentially Russians complaining about how horrible and dramatic this war has been for them personally as well, even if of course that's still below what has been to Ukraine. So yes, Russia comes into February 24th from the point of complete lack of understanding what was going on. I was in Russia back in January 2022, and I was shocked by how different their world was from the US world. In the US, everybody kept talking about the possibility of the imminent invasion, and I remember Russian social media discussing the specific meaning of the word imminent. You know, how imminent was it? Nobody wanted to believe it, and the common assumption was it's just, you know, another conspiracy, like by Americans. They just create another Iraq for whatever purposes. They pretend that something's going to be, but nothing was really coming. So not to be surprised. So therefore, on February 24th, everybody, including majority of the Russian elites, woke up in a state of the huge shock. And of course, it took them some time to develop some sort of responses, most of them psychological, because really little less that they can do in the realities of the Russian regime. Those responses eventually, after the period of, you know, chaotic shock and, you know, really many people were completely broken as a result of this change in reality. But after a while, you see the elites and the society more broadly, and in the Russian case, there's really no meritocracy, so the elites fundamentally are not different from the society. In some ways, they're worse than the ordinary Russians is. You see them developing these responses where, all right, this is the reality, and you know what, yeah, we're bad, but you know, Ukrainians also had it coming, and the West also is not completely innocent in all of that. And ultimately, it was Biden who is to blame because he misled Putin somehow. So all the psychological responses that are being developed on the side of the society and the elites in place that have eventually ended up crafting this fragile, unwilling, I'd say, acquiescence around this new reality. And it's very different from what you've seen back in 2014, where people really rallied around this annexation, Crimea is ours, right, the sentiment of enthusiasm and general hopes about Russia's future. That's not the case today. One of the most reliable indicators is not necessarily even what people tell you directly about this war in the polls, but how they report their sentiments, right? The sort of feelings that they report. And we see a lot of anxiety, stress, fear, uncertainty about the future, which has been really characteristic since the start. Even Kremlin's own agencies on Telegram, social media, for example, consistently are concerned about the sense of stress and anxiety that's been spreading around the society. So that is, I guess, the reality today. But unfortunately, all of those psychological self-defense mechanisms, right, always push towards, even if unwilling, acquiescence and acceptance rather than resistance. And that is just sad reality of Russia that we're dealing with. Part of the problem is, the last thing I'm going to say, is the perception of identity. As we come to realize, and for me, that's one of the things that I've learned, rational economic self-interest is not always the only driving factor, and living in the United States, populism also actually acts on similar mechanisms. People really value their identity. In the Russian case, the stakes of losing their identity have become really high. It's hard for many Russians to accept that what they're doing in Ukraine is really disastrous, horrible crimes against humanity and international law. So it's much easier to believe in these narratives that they're good liberators against the hostile world. And the identity, this identity is built around Putin, and in a lot of ways it sort of makes this regime and Putin's personality irreplaceable for them, because there's no alternative positive identity that they can find in today's world, and that's a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Michael, Maria called us out a little bit as former Obama administration officials that had some role in working on Russia-Ukraine support. I'm curious, when we look to the U.S. response to Russia's invasion, were there, a lot of the same people right now in the Biden administration were in the Obama administration. Were there lessons learned from the response in 2014, 15, 16 to Crimea and Ukraine, and what do you think some of those lessons were?
Well, that's a very important question in terms of understanding the present moment, and I think that it goes back to some of the things Dara was saying earlier in terms of one of the maybe the most important lesson learned for the U.S., which was an amalgam, really, of American failures from Crimea to the election meddling of 2016, which was to be highly reactive, and I think especially really of 2016, the election meddling, which of course we remember well as sort of being in government at that time. And the government was really wrestling, understandably, with attribution questions. It's WikiLeaks, there was sort of these layers of plausible deniability that Russia built into its operation, and that sort of hamstrung the US government, in addition to the Obama administration not wanting to be overly political and sort of meddling. So they were on their back heels, and that allowed the operation in some ways to go forward and to be more effective. I don't think that that's been forgotten by any member of the Biden administration that was in government in 2016. So that was reversed in 2021, 2022 in a very effective way. Instead of waiting for it to happen, instead of sort of being very concerned about intelligence sharing because of sources and methods, you see a very aggressive posture on the US government of overtly using intelligence to throw the Russians off their game. And I think that probably did affect, maybe Dara, you would know better than I, the timing of the invasion, that I think Putin wanted to go maybe a little bit earlier and had a date in mind and a false flag operation, and I think that the US sort of bumped him off of that trajectory, and that could have affected in some ways how poorly the initial phases of the war went. So that's, I think immensely important. I don't think that the diplomatic qualities that the Biden administration has shown are necessarily lessons learned. I think that that's what the Obama administration tried to do, is to create a big coalition with sanctions and to use diplomacy. Maybe it didn't have as much effect as the Obama administration wanted it to have, diplomacy in those years. I mean, I think that you could maybe say this, I don't know if the Biden administration would agree on this point. One of the things that Obama wanted to see during that very fraught phase, starting with the annexation of Crimea and then the battles of the summer of 2014, he wanted to see this be the hour of Europe. And so who's sitting at the table when Minsk diplomacy is negotiated in September 2014 and then February 2015? It's France and Germany. And so this was to be the kind of European leadership, a sign that this was no longer the 1990s, it was not Dayton, it was not the Kosovo War, it was Europe taking the lead. And it's not that this isn't important at the moment, and I think that the Biden administration still wants Europe to sort of take the lead, but they've not waited for Europe to take the lead. They've been very proactive. And in some ways, the US has been more at the center of the story than Europe has with the 2022 war, and that could be a lesson learned that's sort of possible. The very final point I would make in terms of lessons learned, not to be too celebratory of the Biden administration, I think in 2014 there was not really a great sense of where the strategy was going. This is where we want to be in 3 years. I mean, obviously, in a normative sense, the US wanted Russia to get out of Crimea and to get out of eastern Ukraine. That was the desired objective, but strategically, how to get there, that was never fully consolidated and confirmed. And I think the Biden administration is, to a degree, still in that bind. It's very hard for them to say where they want things to be 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. So there are still a few lingering strategic ambiguities, and that does remind me a little bit of 2014. But on balance, the lessons learned are exceptionally important.
Yeah, I think maybe just one additional point on the security assistance side, where I was more focused in government. We had this really inane debate over Javelin missiles and whether to provide Javelin or not. And this was both a question of escalation, and to be fair, it would have been escalation as we hadn't provided any sort of equivalent lethal system at that time. The fear was that it would be used offensively against Russian forces that were in Ukraine. I mean, the fear, and that would prompt Russia to launch a wider scale invasion. So there was that escalation concern, but there was also just a logistical concern of every time we thought the Russians were going to really pour in, and there would be a meeting of how long would it take Javelin to get to the battlefield. It would be like 3 months. And then you would have 6 months later, there'd be, oh my God, the Russians are going to come back again. How long will it take to get Javelin missile there? We're like 3 months, because we didn't say yes to the decision earlier. And we hadn't fully sort of shifted our security assistance posture. And then what happens sometimes in government is you just default on a non-lethal policy that was never actually, we didn't have a non-lethal policy to the previous Ukrainian government, but we did to the post-democratic one. And it just sort of defaulted into place without a lot of debate or discussion, and that sometimes happens in government.
I could just jump in with a very brief point. One of the things that I really regret was myself being persuaded by Angela Merkel's statement in 2014 that there's no military solution to the problem. It's a huge conceptual mistake. I thought it was sounded sort of persuasive. Well, that's a way of sort of managing the crisis, and obviously we're not going to go to war with Russia over Crimea, so it sort of seemed persuasive, but now it seems to me absurd. What Russia did in 2014 was conduct a series of acts of war, and so how could there be a no military solution to a war? The only solution to a war is in effect military, and I think that there's no conceptual confusion about that now, and that's a step forward.
And it's also sort of the default State Department response, I remember in 2014, is to call for calm, to call for, nonviolence, and because if you don't know what to say, that's what you say, that we hope there's just peace. But one of the things that we saw, and to transition to the present, and then is I think what the security assistance we did provide, although it's non-lethal, we provided hundreds of millions of dollars, or more than $1 billion, in security assistance that couldn't be lethal, so couldn't really be the expensive stuff, but was oftentimes focused on things like radios and other things that were kind of dismissed at the time, but actually provide a degree, enable the Ukrainian forces to maybe fight better together. But then what we saw with this war, Dara, to maybe transition to the present, is U.S. provide just massive quantities. I mean, jaw-dropping amounts, doing things that I had never seen the U.S. do on the security assistance side, providing, I think, in this year, more than $25 billion in security assistance. To put that in context, Israel gets, I think, around $3.5 billion a year and have been the largest recipients. So just a huge influx of military assistance. Maybe you could talk about how critical that's been and maybe bring us closer to the present in terms of how did the war sort of pan out? After the first phase of Russia's invasion started to go awry, where did they go from there, and how did we get to where we are right now?
Well, I think the Russians at war start assumed that there wouldn't be meaningful resistance, but if there was, Ukraine's organic supplies would probably last them into the spring. And if you listen to Ukrainian officers speak to the press and other reports out there, they also have a similar point of view. If you listen to them speak about that time period of early summer 22, before a lot of the heavy U.S. systems, heavy NATO systems started arriving, there was real concern. Like, we're reaching the bottom of our own artillery stockpiles. We're taking a lot of losses. I think the really decisive point was probably in May, June, when you started getting the signals and the deliveries of artillery and everything else that came after that. The Russians, I do not think were anticipating that. I don't think they were anticipating that there would be this type of targeting support. By this time, the Russians had figured out their electronic warfare. They didn't have time to deconflict that. There was a lot of fratricide, so they were jamming themselves as they were jamming the Ukrainians. They largely fixed a lot of those issues by the summertime, which is why you started seeing Ukrainian drones, Ukrainian reconnaissance becoming slightly less effective. Well, who stepped in and filled the void? The answer has been there all along. The Russians, I don't think were anticipating that they would be facing this sort of super empowered Ukraine, organically from their own courage, and then supported by the Western coalition. So how have they adjusted to that? There's some things they can fix, and again, there's some things they can't. So what they've done is they've had to consolidate first from Kyiv, then the Kharkiv area collapsed on itself in the late summertime. They withdrew from the west bank of Kherson. It was a military untenable position. The Ukrainians were closing in on them. They had a river behind them. They had to withdraw, and they did, largely without losing very many of their airborne, some of their more elite forces who are now fighting on the line again near Crimea and other areas. So in the fall time, you saw the Russians understand their position a little bit, understand we've lost an incredible amount of people. Our soft attempts at mobilization through trying to scrape the bottom of different pools of people in Russia wasn't yielding results that they needed. And so they took a step they didn't want to do, which was mobilization. I think that they attempted the political annexation before they had the theater set. I think they thought that if they annex 4 Ukrainian oblasts and declare them as Russia, then they can threaten nuclear weapons and everybody would freeze in place. Maybe they were themselves going back to the Crimea example, because no one really militarily contested that. Ukrainians had many struggles and could not. They were different military at that time. But the international community didn't really contest it, and they didn't accept it. No one has officially, but de facto they did. So in the fall, you saw the Russians move into this defensive position. They started making a series of positions. They've dug trenches everywhere. They're trying to set conditions that would make very difficult for a Ukrainian counteroffensive, whether it's mines or other kind of traps that they lay for them. And, you know, looking at it at that time, you're thinking, you know, at least I was thinking, okay, well, they seem to understand their position. They're going to sit here for 6 months, take a defensive stance, tell the mobilized to come in, get them trained up and move forward in the summertime. But then, you know, to get to the current present, they changed their leadership team again. They changed it in January and they put Gerasimov back in charge. Gerasimov presumably was the military's architect for their invasion plan, which didn't go well, understatement, and they put him back in charge. And you have to ask yourself why. You know, was it a personality conflict or was it really a rejection of the approach of sitting on the defensive is not really something that's acceptable for Putin. He's ordered a mobilization of 300,000 people. He didn't do that just to have them sit in trenches. I suspect, based on what they've said and what they're trying to do today, they're trying to reach the boundaries of Donetsk and Luhansk and have all 4 Ukrainian eastern oblasts. I don't know if there's a timeline involved. I think there probably is still an unchanged maximalist objective for Ukraine. They lack the ability to execute that. A question mark for me is what are they doing behind in Russia? There's some reports today that air power is moving around the border. There's satellite imagery of them creating tent camps where they can house thousands of mobilized closer to the border. They are moving equipment out of long-term storage in Siberia. They have been doing that all along, but they're doing it right now. So there's something afoot. I think we should be really distinct here about intent. The intent is present. The capability to execute this is not. That being said, if you look at how they're fighting this right now in Luhansk, in Donetsk, there's a lot of brute force tactics going on, a lot of human waves, 24/7 artillery. There's some air power being committed to Bakhmut, but not in other areas because it's very costly for the aircraft. Again, leading infantry support with no air coverage because your planes are precious, right? But your people, you have millions. And I'm in a very deep, cynical place about this, so I want to preface that. But that's where they are. You know, whatever it takes to get to this objective. And I think that's why they put Gerasimov back in charge, because he will just comply.
Maria, maybe to turn over to you, Dara mentioned the mobilization that Putin announced in September after the Ukrainians had really gone on the offensive and taken a lot of territory back, we're on the verge of taking back Kherson, but taking back territory in the north. Mobilizing, i.e. pulling men who had served as conscripts once when they were 18, 19 in the Russian military, but now we're in their 20s and 30s and 40s and sometimes 50s and have families or are breadwinners or work and have important jobs, and pulling those people off the streets and sending them to war strikes me as a really risky thing to do for the Kremlin politically, internally. It seems thus far that they've kind of weathered any outrage. How has sort of the Russian public opinion reacted to mobilization, the high casualties that we've seen, more than 100,000 casualties, killed and wounded? Mobilization strikes me, I mean, just thinking back to our own Vietnam experience when we had the draft and how culturally and politically divisive that was. Has there been any reaction in Russia, and how has Russian public opinion reacted?
Yeah. So when I'm going to start slightly from far. When we discussed the impact of sanctions, waiting for them to, crash the ratings of the regime, it's important to keep in mind that in the last year, the one biggest event that really crushed Putin's approvals was of his own doing through mobilization. It's by far the largest event, the event that has driven the largest decline in approval for Putin, and as usually is the case in Russia, because Putin is in this way, it's the symbol of this regime, right? It also drew down all of these ratings of the social moods, the perception of the country's direction, all other authorities' ratings, etc., etc. We have seen the very similar correlation during the Crimea period, going in the opposite direction. So from that perspective, yes, the effect of mobilization was very pronounced. It's the first event throughout the last year that made Russians realize that the war really concerns them personally. Because like for most Russians, even now, even in the post-mobilization period, right, this special military operation that they insist on calling it often is something that happens somewhere that does not concern them personally, and the Kremlin is dealing with it. They're big adult people. They know how to manage that. I'm just a small, ordinary person. I know nothing. That's the general attitude. Comes mobilization, hey, they come to realize that they actually concerns them personally, and that's a big deal. Having said that, there's also a huge inertia in the Russian society and the Russian system more broadly, and the resilience that we sort of come to learn, and yet again, it's been learned before us by previous generations of Western policymakers. The resilience of this system is remarkable. Partly it's the internal desire of the people just, continue as usual. And that's something that even my pollster sociologist friends in Russia confirm. Like, people insist on continue living their life as normal as if. And that's one of the reasons after the mobilization happened, you actually saw the ratings for the authorities and everything else bouncing back real fast. And right now they're pretty much back to normal. In fact, if you look at the polls in Russia today, with all the necessary reservations that it's an autocratic regime, polls are not very reliable, but at least the dynamic we can rely on. Fairly, assuming the bias is essentially more or less constant in the polls, you see the remarkable results. Russians are very optimistic about the future. They're hopeful this war or special military operation is not going to last. Things are going to go back to normal, and eventually they'll be friends with the West as before. After all, this has happened already after 2014. This is really like an alter universe, frankly, if you look at the polls. And also something for us to keep in mind, right? There's a very insistent inertia there that wants to continue as if. Having said that, can they really, right? That's what they want, but can they continue as usual? Most likely the answer is no. Right? The design of sanctions is completely unprecedented. It's going to strangle Russian economy in the long term. The effect of the energy embargo and the oil price cap are already quite visible. Putin himself tried, by the way, he understood that mobilization may be problematic, right? We saw that was highly unpopular among Russians even before it was announced. And that's one of the reasons why I would argue the Russian decision makers, right, they try to delay mobilization to the extent possible, and only when they realize they can no longer hold on to the territories that they occupied, that they had to announce it, right? However, now it seems that, again, the Kremlin also sort of getting into this mode that mobilization will continue, and that means that as long as the war continues for a while, and that's probably going to be the case, the mobilization will be there, and Russia is facing very much a repetition of its own history. Late Soviet Union and Afghanistan situation, where again this consistent drain of the society imposed by the war will probably continue for a while, and so will the stagnation and general feeling of hopelessness and lack of direction that was so typical of the late Soviet Union. Of course, it's a market economy, it will adjust unlike the Soviet Union economy, but nonetheless things are going to be pretty bad. Under circumstances like that, how long is the Russian society going to be able to take this? Our analysis based on comparative experiences of Iran and South Africa suggests that eventually this is bound to lead to some sort of social protests, just because people realize that these things are not going in the right direction. And historically, economic decline in Russia is linked to social protests. For example, the 2011-12 welfare protest was in part a result of the 2008 financial crisis with a delay. And in 2018, after a very unpopular retirement age increase, you also saw actually social protests spreading around the country. The Kremlin realizes that if you look at the budget approved for 2023, that already, by the way, has been run with deficit in January, but that's a separate story, probably because of the energy sanctions. So if you look at that budget, you'll see that the social spending has been on the rise by the Kremlin, and targeting the specific groups that target the classic Putin supporter. We're talking about retirement age people. We're talking about people, low-income people with multiple children, for example. So this dynamic is clearly there. We see that the Kremlin understands the problem. Most likely, the problem is unsolvable in the long term, but much, of course, will depend on the resilience of the West and the willingness to continue the sanctions imposed on Russia.
Right, thank you for bringing up sanctions, because that was another thing that when we went into this war, unprecedented sanctions. The hope was that sanctions would prove as some silver bullet, would sort of tank the Russian economy, end the war. But I like to say, as we've seen, banks don't stop tanks, and the sanctions have clearly had a really negative impact on the Russian economy, but Russia's economy has in some ways proved more resilient. The Russian central bank responded quite effectively. But so your prognosis, maybe turning forward, is that through 2023, Russia faces a real economic problem, that the energy sanctions that are coming into place, the continual degradation of their economy. They've had an initial injection of spending in 2022, which has stimulated their economy, spending on wartime industries, but that's going to be difficult to sustain.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult. Most likely, of course, unfortunate problem with sanctions is that they tend to work at first, and then Russia typically finds a way around, or not necessarily Russia, Iran. So they sort of fill in the holes, the biggest holes, right? Although not entirely. So Russia's energy revenues will be down, right? But by how much will they be down in the long term? That's the biggest question right now. Today, Bloomberg came out with an article saying that Russian tankers, that they take forever, much longer now to make it to Asian markets because they're essentially cut off of the European markets. So that's one of the factors. There's also the price cap, that there will be others. But again, there's so many factors that sort of play into that situation. One thing we understand for sure, energy is Putin's regime Achilles' heel. This is where it really hurts. And one reason why big financial macroeconomic sanctions failed to deliver as much as we hoped back in 2022 was the unprecedented energy revenues that fully compensated for the effect of the financial macroeconomic sanctions. And here, that's one thing that we need to understand, and I think we're pretty clear about it. Energy is where it hurts, and this is where the major blow should be delivered. I want to say credit to the European Union that's been able, frankly, really, really quickly to introduce completely unprecedented sanctions. So let's hope that continues.
Yeah, I think one of the lessons perhaps of 2014 is that you can put sanctions in place, but it's actually the maintenance of sanctions, which is a huge bureaucratic lift, huge intelligence lift to identify how Russia's getting around sanctions, how they're being able to import various products that are critical to maintain their defense industries and maintain their economy. So that's one of I think the X factors when we look forward is the bureaucratic energy and attention and priority given to maintaining sanctions. Let me sort of now pivot to the kind of big question that everyone's asking: where is this war going? How does it end? Let's sort of turn to the crystal ball. We'll bring it out. We can look into it and see how do we think things are going to play out over the next year. Impossible to know, but Dara, maybe I'll start with you on the military side, on how you see things, playing out in the next week, month. I'll sort of leave it open to you. And what are the sort of things that you're looking for?
Well, to quote Mike Hoffman, who's not here, if I could channel him, he would say it's contingent. So copyright Michael Kaufman. So there's a lot of things that can happen, and there's a lot swirling around right now. So instead of making predictions on the most likely course of action, maybe I can lay out some signposts of things that may happen. I think, and again, I look at the Russian side mostly, and it's important to keep in mind the Ukrainians are experiencing shortages of ammunition. If that's going to happen for them, it needs to happen pretty soon, from my perspective, delivering it to the front line. For Russia, if they were trying to take a more limited approach and try to reach the boundaries of Donetsk and Luhansk and essentially stop there so that Putin can claim that he has all 100% of these annexed Russian lands, that probably is possible from forces they have behind the line in country and maybe waiting to come in along the border. I don't think it will look competent. I think that it will be an exceptionally high rate of loss, just based on the different ingredients that they need for success are no longer present. You have to understand that they've lost most of their trained personnel, either through being killed, casualties, or who resigned when they had the ability to do so prior to June 22. They've been stop-lossed in place and are fighting basically continuously. This is not how you have a combat-effective soldier. There is the unanswered question of how will they use the Air Force. I don't know if my mic is going up. No. Okay. They've been very conservative with their Air Force, partially because they have had technical solutions for it. The Ukrainian air defenses still work at echelon. They still lose aircraft when they commit them. There is a larger question of whether we're seeing right now is the phase one of an offensive, and there's going to be some sort of rolling follow-on forces where the Russians commit battalion tactical groups over and over and over again through the summertime. To answer that question, you would have to look out for where it's moving from deep reserves out in Siberia. Is it moving to the front line? Is it congregating again? Is it being sent through repair facilities? Is it going to tank factories to try to...
We're gonna pause you.
Sure, am I getting... Okay, sorry about that. This one's good? Okay, sorry about that. So yeah, there's a few different ways that this can go. I still remain concerned that there's a discrepancy between what the Kremlin thinks it has in terms of a military that's left versus the reality on the ground. And I often wonder, does anyone in Russia see what we see? I mean, Facebook's cut off, Twitter's cut off, YouTube, I think, just got frozen this week, I'm not sure, but there's just such a different information space from what they see and from what I can see, which makes it, very difficult for, I think, us as Westerners to understand how there can continuously be so much apathy in Russian society for how these mobilized are being treated. They are just cannon fodder, and they actually, they make pleas to governors, and they know that they are that. They know that they're cannon fodder. They describe themselves as such. So, they do have, in terms of raw numbers, they could run another wave of mobilization incrementally to try to keep the peace at home, or they could announce another large wave. They haven't reached the bottom of their demographics by any stretch. They could continuously do this at cost. And that's the calculation, how much can I get away with before I start to bring people to the streets? They're very attuned to that. So in terms of what happens, what I'm thinking might happen is we're seeing this push right now. I think it will continue along these limited areas. Again, the big question for me is, what is phase two? Is there a phase two? Are they going to try to bring in additional armor with people who are not well trained, with equipment that is barely serviceable, old equipment like BMP-1s, for anybody who's familiar with that system? These are things they used in Afghanistan. So it's again, a mismatch between, we're back again, like we were a year ago, between the Kremlin wanting more than the military can actually deliver. And I think that's dangerous.
Right. It had sort of seemed that the Kremlin had sort of smartened up with Surovikin, that they were consolidating, really focused on maintaining what they had. and kind of content with essentially a frozen conflict that just sort of continues endlessly and deprives Ukraine of potentially its European future, and it prevents reconstruction. But now it looks like, again, they're going on a hapless, or maybe not hapless, we'll see, offensive that we'll see how that progresses. Michael, maybe to turn it over to you in terms of maybe you could talk a little bit about how you think things will sort of play out, or what are the things that you're looking for? What do you think Russia's current objectives are? I mean, it can't be to sort of reclaim Kyiv and to topple this government. Regime change has to sort of be off the table. So if you're in the Kremlin, what are your kind of war aims, and then and what would they be content with in the end?
Well, to burnish my crystal ball, and maybe to disagree slightly with the framing that Michael Kaufman, with his love of contingency, might give to the war, you can give a counter-framing to the war, which is one that is, rather than contingent, is structural. And I suspect it will be a long war. I mean, it sort of is already, and in long wars, political economy plays a huge role. We could go back to the American Civil War, where the North wins, not because they had better generals, I don't think that they did, and so their military performance left quite a bit to be desired, but the political economy of the North was unbeatable and was decisive for the war. In the First World War, it's not that the Germans exactly get beaten on the battlefields of that terrible war, but they do implode internally, which had a lot to do with the blockade and factors related to political economy. And I think in the Second World War, you would also say the U.S. ability and also the Soviet ability to manufacture tanks and aircraft and war material was really decisive for the outcome of the war. So I think if you take a structural reading of the current war, there's no way that Russia wins. I don't see any route forward because the powers arrayed against Russia are simply too great, and they constitute the world's most, sort of wealthy and technologically advanced nations, or at least most of these nations. You would want to factor in South Korea and Japan, that are not, on the front lines of providing military assistance to Ukraine, but are a part of the sanctions regime and sort of still a part of the story. So Russia has picked a fight, it seems to me, on the basis of political economy that it's not able to win, even if it can maintain relationships with India and China and acquire chips, sort of through smuggling or, sort of back channels and such. I mean, I just think that gradually the political economy will compound all of the military failures that Dara has been describing over the past hour or so. And so I think that that's plausible and significant, but I would introduce a wild card, I guess back to contingency, inevitably, which is the Russian capacity to wreak havoc within Ukraine and also within Europe. That's the dog that hasn't barked yet in this conflict. I'm sort of waiting for it to happen, a cyber strike on a European country of 2016 magnitude in terms of political meddling perhaps, but even something that would hit critical infrastructure, banking system, seems entirely possible to me and could change the nature of the war in some ways. There's been a trickle of news over the last week or so about Russia trying to stage a coup in Moldova. Seems eminently believable to me, and I think that sort of stuff is something that we should definitely keep in the foreground of our thinking about the war, because Russia has capacities there that they haven't used so far, and they could well start to do so. But just within Ukraine, a third of Ukraine's GDP, sort of lost over the course of the last year. The attacks on water supply and electricity, haven't paid huge dividends for Russia and further mobilized the Ukrainian population against the Russian war for sure. But that, I think, is a kind of wild card in the war. And I think that the Russian goal now, I mean, obviously they would love to take Odessa and sort of widen the possessions that they have in the south of Ukraine. That seems sort of fanciful to me, and I think Kiev is just off the table. But I think the goal now may be just to concede to the West a Ukraine that is as damaged as possible. And I have to say I regard that with absolute dread, that sort of project, because I think the Russian capacities to wreak havoc within the territory of Ukraine are pretty considerable. So it becomes a kind of nihilistic war in that sense. It's not really about winning, it's just about sullying what you may be on the verge of losing, but it's still pretty worrisome.
Yeah, I really like how you put that, the sort of structural reading of the war, and if you kind of put our political economy, our collective West's political economy versus Russia, they're sort of no chance. But on the other hand, I think one of the big X factors and variables is the ability for us to maintain that level of support, that additional 25 billion. Are we going to be able to provide 25 billion this year, the same that we provided last year? I think there's real questions whether we ourselves, our industrial bases, both in the U.S. and in Europe, are going to be able to maintain the level of supplies. There's a meeting at NATO today or yesterday talking about the needs for Ukraine, and Europeans militaries, which were not heavily invested in, are now finding the cupboards pretty bare. So I think one key X factor, and maybe one of the lessons learned, I think, from 2014, was that sometimes the Western attention can easily shift to other things, whether, if there's a Chinese balloon in the air, suddenly we are focused on that. And I think that's one of the key challenges. So one thing I would just maybe say, I'm taking moderator's preference here, is that I think there's been constant fear that Europe would crack. And I think the war was so shocking to Europeans, and that Europe has fully pivoted to Russia as an adversary. We must do everything that we can, and we're seeing now a 10th sanctions package. So the exact opposite of sort of what we saw in 2014, where Europeans did sanctions, and they renewed them every 6 months, but didn't really do anything additional. And now they're constantly looking for ways to strengthen them. And so the kind of bureaucratic nature of government has kind of been pointed, if you describe it as an aircraft carrier, has been pointed in a direction that I think is going to be very difficult to turn around. But that doesn't mean that attention from political leaders, the need for more resources, I think all of that becomes a real challenge. Maria, maybe turn it over to you to look in the crystal ball. How do you think this war will head? What do you think the dynamics are, perhaps internally in Russia, going forward? Whether Putin can maintain essentially, if we're going to have this war of attrition, this kind of U.S. Civil War style conflict that goes on and on and on, can they maintain that? Dara points to militarily, it looks like they can, but will there be enough political public support for that?
Yeah, I'm going to start with maybe a somewhat unpopular idea that something that maybe some Western policymakers don't like to acknowledge, but de facto for Putin, right, this is the war with the West, not just the war with Ukraine. It's a proxy war with the West, right? It's been thought through Ukraine, but it's a war with the West, and I think that's how it should be dealt with and treated on our side as well. Because Putin is committed, and to him it's clearly an attempt to show not just to Ukraine and neighboring states, but also other countries in the world that essentially the West can be challenged. And I agree that with Michael, fundamentally that's the war that he cannot win. The proportion of, I think, total GDP of the countries on the West and Ukraine combined to Russia's is 40-1, and this is not how you win wars. So the question to me is not can he win, but how badly can he fail, right? And this, I think, this is the biggest puzzle of the coming years. Because to me, and I said before, the narratives that are already ascribing Ukraine the victory are misleading, and they're dangerous because they make us relaxed and they sort of curdle a possibility of future assistance to Ukraine. While, as a matter of fact, if Putin was to contend with, 4 regions, if he was to fully occupy them and annex them, that would still be not a full failure, and he can still sell it domestically to the society that actually, as I said, Russians just want to accept normality, right? They want things to go back to normal. So at some point, he could potentially stop and say, hey, here are the 4 regions. Azov Sea is now Russia's internal sea. Hey, this is like very 19th century politics of occupation and invasion, and live happily ever after. And if anything, we have Iran as a very unfortunate but very good comparison to Russia's possible future. A regime that's, not doing very well, but managing to inflict a lot of misfortune on its neighbors and domestically as well. So that's quite a clear possibility to me, and the biggest question is this the likely scenario, or are we able to do something with it? And the biggest challenge to Putin against that scenario is, I think, internal domestic situation. This is where sanctions end up playing the largest role. I completely agree that banks don't stop tanks, but at the same time, this war, in terms of the pure money needed to fight it, is fairly cheap for Putin. He can continue for a while. Sergei Alexashenko, of the Russian, formerly from the Russian Central Bank, he often says that, hey, this is actually not expensive for Putin. The only thing that can make it more expensive is internal instability. The regime that Putin built in Russia historically relied on this perception of stability, and we see how people are really in Russia desperate to hold on to this idea even when the surrounding world is collapsing. To the extent that sanctions are able to undermine that perception and to show Russians that the war is not something they may or may not see on TV screens, but is something that concerns them personally and comes directly to their houses, I think this is where the real problem for Putin, the real weakness of Putin's lies. And the question is to what extent sanctions will be able to really show it to ordinary Russians who are otherwise, unfortunately, cut off of alternative information available to them. That's the biggest question, and from my perspective, in order to finally learn historical lessons, rather than constantly repeating this late Soviet Union dynamic, Russia needs to fail because, unfortunately, it has not been able to learn otherwise.
Great. Well, I want to turn to any questions from the audience. Maybe if, yes, sir, right here. Please wait for the mic, and if you could identify yourself.
Okay, thanks. Keith Smith. I used to work here at this place for a long time ago. But the question, you mentioned Sergei Guryev. He mentioned something recently that Putin might be motivated to do this adventure because of not only is he 70 this year, but he's also being trailed by a group of oncologists when he travels, cancer specialists. And he thought it was pretty clear that, in fact, Putin does have some form of cancer. And whether he thought that might be motivating him to some extent to do what he did at this time. Any thoughts about that?
So, Maria, maybe if the health of Putin, but maybe also to broaden it too, of that this is such a centralized regime around him, and there have been some chatter of whether Putin could be replaced by someone else, perhaps in the inner circle. Do you think this? If something were to happen to Putin, is this regime just done for? Or, maybe you could talk to the rumors about his health.
Yeah. So first of all, one thing, this rumor has been consistent in the among Russian commentators. One prominent person to spread it is Valery Solovey, who says that consistently. I have not heard Sergei Guryev actually saying that. But one thing that actually confirms that his health is somehow compromised is that in the recent period, if you show Putin appearing in public spaces, usually he is alone. And the latest one was the Russian the Christmas. Those Christmas, usually he would be surrounded by people. Now he's consistently by himself. That suggests it might be something with the health. Having said, are we going to be as lucky? Are we going to be counting on, divine justice to solve the problems for us? I don't think that's a healthy way of thinking about these things. Plus, the rumors about this cancer are based on the analysis of the doctors who surround Putin during his trips, while that's some experts who looked at those, the number of doctors who travel with him, say that it's not unusual for a leader of the state to travel. Like, it doesn't necessarily indicate some big problem. So there might be some trouble with the health. To what extent it's deadly, we don't know. There's not a lot of, I don't have more evidence to say that. Maybe other speakers will correct me. Having said that, really, this leads us to the question, what's going to happen to Putin's regime, right? The regime is personalistic, and a lot of legitimacy of the regime is built around Putin. In some ways, as Volodin prominently said, Putin is Russia. In some ways, I'd argue there's truth to that, because this system and its legitimacy is highly reliant on one person only, and that's why in the current system, unfortunately, Putin appears irreplaceable. It's unlikely that the regime will end with Putin still being alive. Now, what happens afterwards is a big question. On the one hand, we have experience of Central Asian republics where also there's strongman leadership, and there were some instances when they would die or live, right? Kazakhstan, for example. The experience teaches us that even when these personalistic leaders leave, the system does not necessarily radically change or democratize, right? There's not a lot of democratic regimes in post-Soviet Asian space. As a matter of fact, they just leave this void, the vacuum, that is over time occupied by another strong man. Yes, also charismatic and the savior of the nation and, you know, the future and the only hope. Venezuela, take for example, right? Chavez is gone, Maduro is still there. How about that? So Russia's future, unfortunately, still looks quite personalistic and centralized to me. Having said that, historically, looking at Russia's trajectory over the several last 100 centuries, we see that after a catastrophic defeat of a previous ruler, or when the country finds itself in some sort of really bad place, and the leader is gone, the next leader usually does not double down on those mistakes, but tries to correct the way a little bit. Usually it's followed by some sort of reset. After Nicholas I and Crimean War in 19th century, there was Alexander II, the liberator, one of the best Russian Tsar, my favorite Russian Tsar. And after Stalin, there was Khrushchev. Early years, there was an attempted reset with the West. He even traveled to the West. Eventually, it does not really lead to anything good, but at least there was an attempt. And the next ruler will not have so many stakes in this war, really, because the war with Ukraine, like Putin clearly has something personal against Ukraine, and this is really important to him, as Dara has emphasized, right? The intent is very much there. It may not be very much there if the new ruler comes to power under conditions of the economic strain, the society that's unhappy and potentially destabilized. So from my perspective, I would not necessarily expect the beautiful Russia of the future, the meme by the Russian opposition, to come immediately after Putin is gone. But I would expect an attempted reset and an effort to relaunch relationship with the West. This is where I believe we need to learn from past mistakes and attach serious strings to any possibility of reset of sanctions list. It's very clear that Russia, unfortunately, in its current state, represents really serious challenge and threat to the international order. And even without Putin, unfortunately, a lot of systemic conditions will still be there, especially if the wrong leader, again, comes on top of Russia's power. So that should be rethought, and Russia's place in the international system should be rethought if such opportunity ever emerges.
Okay. Let's go here.
Whatever we do, Germany shouldn't send a political figure in a sealed train to St. Petersburg
Yes.
to correct Russia's political
I mean,
problems.
that is a good analogy also with World War I. It not only brought down the Russian Tsar, but also in Germany itself, you had a change in government. It worked both ways. But.
Hi,
Yes.
my name is Dylan Miles Primakoff from the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you all for a really great panel. My question is for Maria. Masha, I agreed with what you said about Russians being acquiescent to this war, I think is the word you used, as opposed to, the strong contrast there with the euphoria we saw in 2014. My question is, given the degree of the government's crackdown on Russian media, civil society, opposition politics in the year before the invasion and in the year since, is really at unprecedented levels, which I don't think people truly appreciate. I think some of the reporting on this has been, covered up by what's been happening with the war, has absorbed a lot of attention, but, people are being sent to jail for long prison terms for social media posts about the war, basically on every week now. It's the new norm. My question is, do you think this is an indicator that the Putin regime was truly concerned about the public response to the war, that it thought that if the public was able to learn what the government's true actions in Ukraine were and to discuss this publicly, that this would be a threat to the regime? You think it's fair to say that the reason they've gone to such lengths is because they're worried about how people would react?
Great, thanks. Maybe we'll take one more question, sir, here, and Nick here in the front.
Hi, I'm Ken Meyercord. Isn't the biggest miscalculation the Russians made in their pre-invasion planning not anticipating the extent to which the United States would go in support of Ukraine, such that we have come to their aid in an amount that is double the military budget of Russia. If we hadn't provided all that aid, the war would be over by now, right? Maybe even on Russians' terms, which were their stated war aims were denazification of Ukrainian society, sort of vague, but maybe just anti-Nazi laws like Germany has. Ukraine gave up its intention to join NATO, and that the two Donbass republics have some sort of autonomy within Ukraine. Wouldn't that be better than what we've got now, or are likely to have in the future if escalation continues?
Thank you. Maybe Maria, you could take the first question on repression and concerned about was Putin concerned about the public response and from the repression that we've seen inside of Russia?
And I'd also be interested potentially to hear what Michael, for example, has to say. But excellent question. Thank you, Dylan. Now, I think that it's important to look at the timing when this wave of repression starts, right? And to me, again, I might be wrong. The timing is associated to mid-2020, when one of the things that happened there, along with the constitutional amendments that are being passed, and now Putin essentially can stay in power indefinitely as a result of these amendments. There's also a large protest in Belarus, after which Navalny get poisoned. Notice the parallel there. To me, honestly, everything that we discussed, that Putin really is concerned about losing Ukraine, Belarus also plays a huge role in that consideration, and to me that was the last trigger that conditioned Ukraine's destiny back in 2020. Right afterwards, you see really the wave of cleansing, I'd say, of the Russian opposition begins, and this time it's, as Dylan says, pronounced across all the groups of the social societies in the part of the Russian society. In the past, it would be targeted on specific, say, politicians, right? Now it's against everybody, right? Lawyers, journalists, NGO activists, politicians, everybody, you name it. To the extent that yesterday, pro-Kremlin channel posted that when one of the regional governors wanted to find one organization locally to fight against violence against women, they couldn't find one that wasn't a foreign agent already. It was literally every single organization is on a foreign agent list, and the pro-Kremlin channel posts that as a problem, actually. So they actually, but also unfortunately, it comes to show how small the Russian civil society is. Like, you really can name all this 1,000 well-meaning people in one list. So from that perspective, I don't think it's necessarily fear of retaliation on the side of society. It's just the general change of the regime, the decision to go, double down, full-blown, right, the intent, that emerges around there, and it really incorporates the elimination of the hostile elements within the society. Having said that, of course, they're right. They're right to go against the independent media that would have spread the true information to the Russians, but it has to do more with the nature of the regime, and I would argue the final and ultimate victory of the Siloviki, the security service elite groups within the Kremlin, the FSB, which also, as I hear, is largely responsible for this big miscalculation, is this war. Essentially, it's this particular hawkish, very insecure wing in the Kremlin that has won and now dominates in the decision-making and gradually takes control over the Russian society.
Great. Maybe Michael and Dara to comment to close us out. We have just a few minutes left.
So two quick points. One about how Putin may be looking at the world. Let me just, in the spirit of being a devil's advocate, sort of turn your question inside out. Maybe he's not feeling great anxiety about the Russian population at the moment. Maybe he's looked at the last 12 years as a remarkable opportunity. It's, of course, hard for us to think in those terms, and to me personally sort of repugnant to think in those terms, but it's possible. It's an opportunity to enhance the powers of the state, which Putin has been trying to do since 2000. It's an opportunity to get rid of the bad apples as he sees them. If they emigrate, terrific. If they keep silent within Russia, that's also excellent. And to elevate those people that he sees in a sense as his constituency. I think Maria was talking about that earlier in terms of who's targeted for government assistance, more rural communities, older communities, as we might say, using the terminology of American politics, his base, so he can boost the power of his base within Russian society. And he can also militarize Russian society, which has been one of the biggest transitions over the last 12 months. But implicit in a lot of the work that Putin was doing culturally before the war, this cultivation of Victory Day and sort of these rituals now associated with the celebration of the anniversary of the Second World War. That long predates the war in Ukraine, but that's been sort of put into overdrive. And so he can get the kind of autocratic, militaristic society he may have been dreaming with all along by waging this war. And so we may want to think about the war as an instrument of Putinism within Russia, and in his eyes, difficult as this is to sort of conceive in a way, not a failure, but so far a kind of ringing success. It seems to me possible. And going back to the question about his health, his body language looks like he's in quite a good mood in the last couple of months to me. Not at the beginning of the war, he looked puffy and nervous and truly anxious. Now I think he looks fairly self-confident and maybe thinking that this aspect of the war is going well for Russia. That's very speculative and could well be wrong, but I just throw it out there as a way of sort of alternate thinking about the situation. Final point I'll make about the U.S. and his misunderstanding of the U.S., which I think is enormous, and Putin has spent very little time in the U.S., mostly at UN General Assembly or visiting the I guess he's been to Texas and he's been to Maine and to a few places outside of Washington D.C. But he really doesn't know anything other than official Washington. He did one of the things that you really don't want to do historically. He's made one of the sort of a historic mistake in the sense that the Japanese made in 1941 and the Germans made 2 weeks later after Pearl Harbor when they declared war in the U.S. What Putin has done is to mobilize the military and the moral energies of the United States. It's the worst thing that you can do as an adversary of the United States. You sort of get the engines of morality going and the engines of military aspiration. You put those two things together and there's probably nothing more formidable in the world than the combination of those two things. And so in that sense, Putin has kicked the hornet's nest and done something that's really an act of sort of counter-statesmanship or anti-statesmanship. And that stems not just from his misunderstanding of Ukraine, but from his misunderstanding of the United States. He should have read, apparently he loves to read Russian history, he should have read more US history.
It's hard to follow that up. But to answer the questions, I think you can see in some ways the contours of their fear that they have. It is now criminalized in Russia to speak, and this is for several years, it's been a process ongoing, but now it's very high. Criminalized to speak about combat deaths, combat casualties. It's criminal to disclose locations of Russian forces. And this is, we're talking about people on cell phones looking at tanks on rail cars. Like that will get you in trouble with the law. You are no longer allowed to do forecasting. You are no longer allowed to talk about or assess how the war will go. But yet they are also demanding that you give them your sons, brothers, and fathers. But you're not allowed to talk about it and what's happening. So you can see the fear. That being said, to agree with my panelists here, there's not really a direct political threat to Putin right now. He has succeeded in that Russian society remains fearful and apathetic, but also focused on their individual family member. How do I keep my son safe? How do I keep my husband safe? Everyone else is upset about this, but I've seen these conversations that women are having with their own son. Here's how you get out of this. You can hide, you can bribe, or when you leave Ukraine, go do this, this, this. And they'll speak about, there's all these women who are upset and they want to complain to the government. What good is that going to do? There's no collective bargaining. And I think that's what Putin is afraid of, but he's put things in place to prevent that from happening, to convince people that their individual voice is meaningless and that nothing that they could do matter. They'll just get arrested. Unfortunately, it has had some effect. The question is, how long can you keep doing this? And to answer your question, sir, about why did they misjudge what they were told about U.S. When senior officials sat down and told them, don't do this, we're going to get involved. Why did they disregard it? I don't know. Maybe they went back to the 2014 model where they thought it'll be sanctions, they'll complain, but our force is so strong and we'll move so rapidly, none of that will matter. And really just make that kind of calculation. And I think about this too at the time. What would their intelligence services have been telling them in January 22, even February 22? I don't know that we had a policy in place that would be what it became. I think there was a huge pivot after the war started in terms of the support that we would rally around Ukraine. So I don't even know what they would have reported if they were even dialed into those kind of conversations. So it's really a historical miscalculation on Russia's part that got them into this mess in the beginning. There's limits to how they can compensate, but again, I don't think we should take our eyes off what's happening here. Putin his mind is like a mind of an abuser, and it's going to keep going. And what really will stop it? And we need to think about those answers.
Just very briefly, we don't have evidence on Putin's health and on his decision-making, but we can all read Shakespeare's King Lear, and I think that that's probably the best insight we can gain into Putin's mind at the moment. It's decision-making of a low caliber, comparable to me to the way King Lear makes decisions in the first half of that play. I think those are the ways that we can probably best try to understand Putin at the moment, and they're pretty, I think, instructive and powerful in some respects.
I want to thank you all. Maybe to end on just sort of a brighter, more optimistic note, is that I think looking back at Ukraine 1 year on, I think the most astonishing thing is Ukraine survived, and that a free and independent Ukraine is now all but assured. Now, there's still a huge, long way to go in this war. And the other thing is that I think we've underestimated Ukraine at each and every phase of this conflict, and yet they've come out stronger and on top. And so while it appears we're entering a rather dark period, a potential Russian military offensive, we'll see if there was a Ukrainian counteroffensive. I think we can still be hopeful that the support that has been coming from the West continues, and that Ukraine will be successful. I want to thank everyone for coming. Before I let you go, let me just say, if you are watching this or you are here, then you are very interested in Russian affairs. You should listen to our podcast, The Russian Roulette, as well as our sister podcast, The Europhile. And if you are a real glutton for punishment, you can tune in at 2 p.m. Where we're going to have a virtual event looking at Europe's response to the war 1 year on. We'll assess more from a European angle how Europe has responded, whether Europe has come out of this war stronger, and I think it has. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists for a really terrific discussion. Thank you.